there are some unique things that can happen. But on average, our potency right now, and this is total THC, so not THCA, not total. Our average is running 23.5% in Montana right now. That's where it is. So I think in rare circumstances we can see that high potency. I think once we start getting into the 40s, that seems odd. Um, but but yeah, so that around that range. But again, it's got those really high ones are a very small percentage of high potency out there. It's not what should be happening all the time. So my name's Cleo. I'm head grower Paradise Organics. We have had a lot of differences between lab to lab, and my question is kind of in these practices that are so like cut and dry, like it has to be perfect. You guys have $1 million worth of equipment, and I can still send the same sample to two different labs and get two very different results. Why is that? Oh, do you guys want to talk about that? Sorry, I don't just got And the second part of that is because we're held to such a standard as growers to keep everything out of, and I say that, and we're not even testing for metals yet, so I should probably. But just for me, it seems like how can I feel confident with a test after I've sent stuff to two different labs and had 10% differences, and for me, it really sucks because it's like, well, we are obligated to shop with the people that give us the better test because if a 5% difference could be the difference between someone buying a product and not buying a product, that sucks. I hate it, but that's the game that we're playing, and that's a different conversation. But how do I feel confident that this test is a legitimate test when I am seeing so much variability? Maybe you guys could both give that an answer. I think it's a good question. Yeah, it's a great question. So let me just say that it's an agricultural product, right? It's not a manufactured product. And manufactured products, we see that are fairly consistent and not very, right? And those should never change between labs based on practices. And by manufactured product, I mean like concentrates, distillate, whatever. Now, flour, I just read an article. It's very good, right? It's very good, and but we also have to assume that the labs are doing everything the same way, from sampling to homogenizing the sample to what solvent are they using to extract with, to which standards they're using to calibrate their instruments with, because there's accredited standard manufacturers out there that we reference your sample against, and they're not all equal either, right? So it's it's a tough industry because there's no set standards of what do you use, what do you do, and many labs do things different, right? Now, that's crazy that there's not those in place. Right, and then the problem with that is federal, right? So like if you're an FDA lab or you're an EPA lab, like EPA metals for water, method 200.8 FDA crickets, EPA crickets, right? Because it's not federally legal. And so that's some of the challenges we face. Is some people claim to have magic sauce. There's magic testing, sample magic, whatever, or we just extract better. And there's maybe a little bit to that depending on what solvent you use, how efficient that solvent is. But overall, there's not a standard. Yeah, and when we started in 2017, there was nothing on the internet pretty much.
That's wild.
We had to be like, okay, like, well, where do we start with this? Now we start with a lettuce extraction, something like that, and figure out how to go
That
from
is
there.
wild.
And it's a cannabis product, but it's getting better. It's definitely getting better. But in 2017, we were just starting, and the guys that were doing this in like Steve Hill in Berkeley, the guys that were doing this in like 2012 or something like that, they had to start from scratch, right? And so we got some of what, but it's also a variable plan. And go ahead, yeah.
So we had the
Testing.
we had the benefit of starting in 2020, right after the pandemic, where AOAC is a community of scientists that come together and are working groups on everything from metals to potency, pharmaceuticals, environmental testing, and one of the benefits for us was that we were able to look at what they had established as a working group and say, okay, they had uh, uh, training and education around cannabinoids, and we took the work that they did and brought that into our lab and validated that for our ISO accreditation. So you have labs that are ISO accredited, um, but if they're not all using the same extraction solvent standards, sample preparation procedures, you can have.
That is wild.
But in South Dakota, our batch sizes are 50 pounds. Um, so, think about the variability that comes from 50 pounds versus 5.
Yeah.
And so we have to develop sample collection procedures that would allow us to take enough increments and enough sample mass to account for the entire 50-pound batch. Eventually, some people, once extraction got off the ground, started to section off their lower grade buds and then just send their A buds to the dispensary. So that kind of evened things out a little bit. But really, what we've seen it come down to is, we have to do audits on our sample collection and do testing for that. And between two different sample collectors, you can have a variance of 5 to 10%. So yeah, literally just coming from the source material, you can't really send two samples from that to two separate labs and expect them to come out the same.
And kind of another thing that you halfway answered there was, I was wondering if there was like a state mandated protocol into testing this product of like kind of micromanaging how you do that job, but it sounds like there's not. It sounds like.
No, we.
So state of Montana does have protocols in place for sampling. And, what they were talking about is sample increments, right? So to decrease variability, for us, we have to take 4 sample increments from a 5-pound lot, which means 4 different quadrants. And so sometimes, you grab, the more sample increments you get, right, the better your representation of that 5 pounds is. And then when it gets to the lab, the state does require us to homogenize 50% of the sample. Now, when that rule came into effect, we did see our potency drop about 3% overall average. Not 3%, maybe 1.5%, somewhere around there. But there was, you're not getting a, best nut with the best trichomes and whatnot. You're basically taking whatever your sampler gives you and you're homogenizing that to 50%. Now, there could be a stem in there, right? There could be new stuff in there. So some of those things they're meant to make it more homogeneous between labs, to make less difference between labs. Now, how labs do it and how it's enforced, right? Enforcement's always been our issue. We're still getting there. But I did just see a LinkedIn article, and they did different tests from different buds on the plant. They did something like 10 of them, and the spread in some of them was very tight, maybe 3%, and in some of them the spread was 10% potency difference. And so another thing we've seen is that if your room is having issues, like if it's a heat issue, we lost the AC or something like that, or maybe something happened, whatever. We see quite a bigger spread between smalls, or smaller nut, and the cola, where if the room is firing on all cylinders, we don't see as much variation between tops, mids, and bottoms. And so that we've also noticed that as well.
I'm not really asking about the variation of the plant. I'm wondering, and you kind of answered that, like we're required to homogenize 50% of it. How many steps does the state mandate? Because like, I'm wondering how lab to lab can do a different they say there's 2 ways to skin a cat. Is everyone doing step by step to get the result, or are people doing different steps to get that result through a lab?
How you do those steps can be different, right? So we use liquid nitrogen and mortar and pestle, right? And liquid nitrogen, what that prevents is the buildup of resin on the mortar to where you do not lose some of that resin, during the grinding process. And that because that resin is frozen with liquid nitrogen, it's powdery and it's homogenized within that. Now, if you were to went into homogenizing with the best way to do it is take your whole 5 pounds and extract it, right? Because that would give you the most accurate result. But obviously, then you don't have anything to sell. And other people will extract it. These guys have a different extract process that we talked about.
Yeah, so for us, like, we use a general grinder and dry ice to grinder, which is actually like a really aggressive beef shaker, if you want to think of it that way. But what it really comes down to is the particle sizes that you grind that flour down into. The other thing that we've seen is, when people send us samples, if they're not already like pre-trimmed, or if they didn't do a good job of trimming, that's going to lower their potency. Or from lot to lot or batch to batch of what they're growing, if it's the same strain, you can have, swings even depending on your microbial load in the state. Like if they're suffering from severe yeast and mold or whatever, if the crop's not as healthy as it was in the first set that you sent in, you can't expect a cultivar or strain variety to have the same potency from one growth cycle to the next. Even if they are clones, your conditions change, seasons change.
And yeah, so another lab put some gloves on and do this, right? So what the state does is the state says we have to do something, but how we do it is up to us.
And that was my question. Thank you.
And we do have to, I imagine it's the same in Montana, but in South Dakota we have to validate every single one of our test methods, and they go through an ISO auditor that comes out and watches us do the method. And if there's any little thing that they can trip you up on, they're going to try to, because it's their job to investigate us to make sure that we're doing what we say we can do and that everything matches up with our validated procedures.
Which for me, that's good, because that I can know how to do better. It's like I hate the fact that I can get 2 very different results from 2 different labs, because I want to do my job the best I can, and if I'm getting faulty numbers,
Well, just stick with one lab.
Yeah. I just got his test results an hour ago.
Good.
And parsing out that difference between the variability, the natural variability in the plant versus the variability between labs. I mean, how are you going to do that? Because the samples are disrupted when we run them. So I mean, you probably have a little bit of each that is playing into it, unfortunately. But
I think this, just to how do we battle something like this, or how do we take care of this problem? And one of the things that I think that we should have, these guys have a reference lab. We've been talking about a reference lab in Montana that is independent. It's not, private business. It's a state lab that can, we have an issue, you can complain, they can test it. And so far we've been having a bit of a challenge with Montana legislators and trying to get that going. We'll continue to try to fight for it. But I think things like that are important, like a reference lab, or even a program that the state does itself, some sort of blind spikes from that they work with you guys to where, we don't know it's the state doing it, that they work with the growers here and they, they'll send 2 samples to the same lab. And we think that it's just you, right? And so that's a real blind test. And nobody's doing it.
That's what we should.
Also, part of ISO accreditation is you have to pass proficiency tests every year, and if you don't, then you're in trouble with your accreditor. So, you know what I mean? Yeah. So high stress, but you have to show that what you're doing actually works.
yeah, so essentially they send us tests that we don't know the potency of, and we need to prove that we are within a specific range in South Dakota. That's what we do.
That's good.
We do know it's a proficiency test, though.
Yeah.
So.
But also educating the public is important on these things. Natural variability.
General question similar to my health too. So if
I were to shop for a lab to run my test my here, from your professional and subject matter, qualify me like, hey, I want to work with this lab. Like, what would you ask if it was your flower to validate that lab knows what they're doing?
I would ask for their PT results.
You were saying a question?
Yeah, he was asking what questions to ask when you're looking for a lab to, if you had like 12 of them to pick from, what questions you would ask. I would ask for their PT results. That's going to give you the best indicator as to, what their method is, how it behaves against an unknown sample, and how it compares to other labs, because these PTs are developed against, hundreds of different labs, and they average those results. And so if yours lands outside of that, then there's something wrong with your process. And having that information, if they don't want to give it to you, that's probably a red flag.
Quick question if we've got time.
So
on the side of even safety for what we're selling to our consumers, I've heard that a test can vary almost in 10% from a small to a top. The testers come in, they pick the bud, they take it away, we get the results. How do we sell a strain that could go from 22 to 32% to the little old lady that walks in and wants to try cannabis for the first time since 1970, and we've got a product listed at 22% that could have such a higher THC content? Granted, numbers are shit. I could smoke it. Not all 30%ers are going to give me the same high, but alcohol hits it on the point every time. We know what we expect when we do that. So from a regulation standpoint, it just seems very dangerous with psychoactive chemicals.
We do have that, like I said, when I was saying manufactured products like alcohol, with concentrates or edibles, edible homogeneities and everything. But we do have these numbers that are pretty good. With flour, yes, there's an issue.
This isn't brought to you by the
And we've thought about, how do we
collective
combat
elevations.
this situation? And first, the lab shopping. What if we just get rid of the necessity for it, right? And you put a flower. We've thought all these ideas, and nothing's been implemented yet. But one thing we're thinking about is that you do just 3 classes of flower. High potency, whatever that range is. Mid potency and low potency, and then you have CBD type, 1-1 or high CBD, something like that. And that again is really difficult for the legislature. It has been really difficult for the legislature to swallow it. What do you mean? We're not going to have a number on there. And they don't understand what you're saying is that there is variability in that, and to put a number on there is sometimes it's either an average, and it could be higher, it could be lower. So yeah, it is an issue. We've come a long way with cannabis and testing and getting data to the consumers, but there's a lot farther to go. And any time anybody has any ideas how to do this, we're trying.
In South Dakota, we have 10% variance on edibles. From if you have 10 milligram edible, it can be up to 11 or down to 9. So there's a 10% variance that the state has put in place for the manufacturers so that they don't have to hit 10 exactly. But we talked about doing something similar to that with flour, where if we took instead of just having like one specific number, if you had a percent range on there, then that would, plus or minus, that would give dispensaries the ability to have a range on there for their customers. That's one idea that the Cannabis Industry Association has talked about in South Dakota. But yeah, I mean, it is a problem because, like, from our perspective, what we have to do is, when we get that flour in and the disbursement of cannabinoids across that material, we have to grind that down into finer particles so that we have something to pull from that represents the sample that we received, which is also an average of what was pulled from the, in South Dakota, 50-pound batch. So it's an average of the sample, it's an average of the test, and so we're just taking averages on that. So, but it would be better to not just have one specific number and say that's exactly what it is for the whole thing.
Up to 2 decimal points, like 24.37.
So, yeah, right on the nose.
Actually, I got a question for you. So, what is the most difficult thing you guys have ever had to test, and why?
Oh man. I think edibles are probably the most difficult things we've had to test. I mean, we've tested smoked out trout. It's a some sort of a smoked trout with cannabis oil on it. And then what else? So there's been beef jerky. But I would say pies are probably some of the most difficult things to test, and because as soon as you start getting away from homogeneity, and we were talking about this last night, and you have 3 cherries in one piece and 1 cherry in another piece, and the THC is in the filling, so the cherry dilutes whatever subsample we take, because obviously we can't extract a whole pie in a 5 liter jug. So some of those challenges have been difficult, but cannabis overall is, we're talking about potency there, but for pesticides, cannabis is the most difficult product to work with, and I would rather work with dirt more than that. I would rather work with, gosh, I don't know, urine, blood, whatever, fluids. Strawberries are so easy, lettuce is so easy. Cannabis most difficult to test. I mean, we have fats, oils, terpenes, cannabinoids, flavonoids, what else? Chlorophyll, other things in there to test. So overall, cannabis has been the hardest product to test because I came from testing strawberries and lettuce, and wow, there's a little bit of water in there, a little bit of chlorophyll, and some pesticides. And so, yeah, I mean, overall, cannabis has been very difficult to test because of its complexity and the number of components in there that make it difficult to extract, dirty up your instruments, and things like that.
Can I ask the last question?
Sure.
Okay. Cultural practices. So I assume you've seen a number of different tests from a number of different samples from a number of different people. Are there any things anecdotally in terms of pass fail that you've noticed are consistent from so many different growers, and most of you are growers? What cultural practices or things are consistent that lead to pass and fail, whether that's with pathogens or with higher potency or microbials, things like that? Any advice you can give just from what you've seen anecdotally?
So in South Dakota, the big one is yeast and mold and aerobic bacteria. So when we go through the winter months, the aerobic bacteria from those periods, and we'll see that uptick happen, right as the thaw starts, and then we get that one really cool late winter storm that comes right in the middle of spring. But right when that happens, that's when the mold microbial issues.
Yeah, and with microbials, that's my main focus. So luckily, I get to hand out the most total yeast and mold failures, unfortunately. But yeah, it's just attention to cleanliness, and it might be different microbial testing here than in South Dakota. But the moisture levels of flour is really in a closed container and then sending it into us. And if it's over 10% moisture, those microbes are going to be really happy, and they're going to keep growing in that microbial. So just attention to cleanliness is super important for that.
And then, yeah, for us, it's always been following, procedures to the T and making sure that just employees can do their job really well, right? And so it's one that was used for. Now they have sprayed some pesticides on their IPM or whatever have to be read, right? So it's like little things of visual cues where mistakes just don't accidentally happen. Because a lot of these times, a lot of the pesticide fails came from just random things that people didn't even think about. Like the bug guys outside had sprayed bifenthrin just for ants, and it was outside the facility. And then through the door jam and all this other stuff, it makes their way. And we're talking one part in a million molecules, one molecule in a million molecules. It's not a lot. And so just continuous, vigilance, I guess, against what's happening, paying attention to the little details, and always doing the same thing, and having procedures for that will really help. Has really set some people apart.
Hey, thank you, you guys. I really appreciate it. I just want to mention. Yeah, so Fidelity Diagnostics are over there, Cannabis Chem Lab over here. I know it's tough, and I understand, because as a cultivator, I'm on the cultivator side, it's frustrating. Ultimately, we're on the same team, but I realize, 10% is the difference between selling all my flower or, struggling to pay rent. So it is a big deal, and I know you guys are working hard to cut down on variability, but it's something that I just think we have to acknowledge, and hopefully it'll keep improving over time. So thank you for answering some tough questions today. Appreciate it. All right, so we built in a little extra time, so let's do a 15-minute break, and we're going to start with Suzanne.